Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to our session on international organizations as a bridge between youth and governments. I'd like to welcome everyone. And just as an overview, we're going to go through some short introductions, and then after that, we will go into panelist discussions, and then we'll open up for question and answers from the audience. So we do encourage everyone to send their questions in the chat box when they come up, and we will address them at the end of the session. So to begin, we're just going to go through a land acknowledgement. So Canada has been the traditional land of the Huron, Wendat, and Seneca, and most recently, the Mississauga of the Credit. Today, this land is still the home to many Indigenous people, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on this land. Additionally, we acknowledge the rich historical Indigenous relationship to the land in which Niagara region engages its work. It is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe people. So just to begin, my name is Christine Salib, and along with Batul Barodi, we will be the moderators for the session. We are additionally Students Young Professional Network executives as part of the CCGHR, which is the Canadian Coalition for Global Health Research. And just to introduce the CCGHR as well. This is a knowledge network promoting equity in health worldwide. We are a member-based, non-for-profit organization representing global health students, researchers, and practitioners at institutions and non-governmental organizations across Canada and globally. The mission is to promote global health research as a model and a driver of collaboration, partnership, and equity in the creation, co-production, and translation of knowledge for evidence-informed decision-making and improved health and well-being globally. So I'm going to pass it on to Batul.
Thanks, Christine, and hi everyone. Welcome to our session. Thanks a lot for attending. So moving on to the just an intro to our session. Since the COVID-19 pandemic and the ensuing social isolation measures have had major impact on young people, and especially among youth who were not able to study or combine study and work before the global health crisis, around 73% experienced school closures, yet the majority were unable to transition into online learning. And with all these lockdown measures, the movement of youth has been affected, which limited their ability to participate in public and civic affairs. So with all these challenges, that leave us with more questions than answers, which local and international organizations must meaningfully consider as we build back together the life post-COVID-19 pandemic. So the CCGHR, an organization founded on the principle of health equity, will contribute to the discussion in the Open Government Partnership Global Summit, Global Youth Summit. So with that, I would start with our questions for the panelists. Let me just first introduce our amazing speakers for today. We have Yibing Ji, Gertrude Omru, and Eric Kiras. And they have amazing life experiences and professional ones, which were already mentioned on the agenda on the website. So with that, I would start with our first question for today. The first question would go to Yibing. So I would start, how can we ensure the active engagement of young people in civic and public spaces amidst global pandemics, such as the COVID-19 crisis?
Thank you so much for the introductions, Batul and Christine. And it's a pleasure to be here with everyone and to speak about such an important topic. So once again, my name is Yipeng. I'm a public health and preventive medicine resident physician here in Ottawa. It's also the unceded traditional territory of the Algonquin people. This is an important question around how young people can participate in civic discussions and public space discussions in the context of a global pandemic. And I think what is crucial is to have a good, very good, even great global public health response to the pandemic. When we are able to have a good public health response, prioritizing health and well-being of individuals, communities, and particularly youth and young people, then not only are we supporting them through an economic and social safety net, we're allowing individuals to be able to do the things that they are able to do and want to do outside of a pandemic. So I think only with a very strong public health evidence-based response and afterwards a recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic, including all of those pieces around social and economic protection, particularly around some of those things that are already mentioned, including disruptions to education, disruptions to employment, volunteering for these formative years for youth and young people that require those pieces of not only mentorship, but also career and professional development to be able to contribute and be current and future leaders during the pandemic. So I'll leave it there. And once again, I'm really happy to share the floor with Gertrude and Eric, who I've known for quite some time and really looking forward to the discussion today. Thanks.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Irving. That you provided a lot of insight about mentorship and preventive medicine. I think that's amazing to jump from that point to Gertrude, because I have, different perspective to share on this question.
Hello, everyone. I'm very excited to see all of you and to note where some of you guys are coming from. Please put it in the chat so we can welcome you all individually. Similar to Yuping, I have a background in health and I did a master's in public health. And so I echo many of the things he is saying. But in regards specifically to the question, how to ensure active engagement of young people, I personally think the onus rests with organization to connect with youth. We understand some of the challenges that youth are having in various parts of the world. Here, we have an economic downturn, and in various countries such as Nigeria, as it's going on, there's police brutality that's very topical to a lot of youth. And so for me, I feel in cases of pandemics, youth should not necessarily bear too much burden to themselves. I agree with you, Pink. The main things that youth should take care of is ensuring their health, ensuring their wellness, ensuring their mental space and their mental health, versus trying to take on everything in the world. And once you have a set base in your personal life, I think that's when you should look towards kind of stepping outside of your personal life and stepping outside of your friends. I think with the global pandemic, I differ a little bit in that with how youth can kind of take the case forward. And maybe Eric has a different perspective. So I'm looking forward to hearing it.
Sure, the floor is yours, Eric.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me, and great to be here again, like Yiping said, with himself and Gertrude. So my name is Eric Carreras. I'm currently stationed in the city of Vancouver. That's the west coast of Canada, and also the presently unceded traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples. I would probably take a blended approach so far, in that I think it is absolutely crucial to make sure one's self-wellness and well-being is put forth and first, because without that you can't give. Ideally, like to give from the overflow, as is kind of how the saying goes. And so with that, you do have to focus on yourself. And I think this was quite evident when I was an ally of the Youth Policy Makers Hub in Ontario. I just moved back to the West Coast recently. And in that time, it was just as the pandemic was hitting. So in the beginning, everyone was very keen, we were involved, we were very much engaged in these civic and public spaces, or working towards that. And as that happened, there was a very marked sort of lull and retreat from that, as folks were working to deal with the challenges that the pandemic brought on. Of course, at that time, it was just the beginning, but I think those needs have just simply evolved and changed, but they're a persistent layer of additional work to deal with on a daily basis. And of course, that'll be different depending where you're living and playing. But I think addressing that first and foremost would be important. It's similar to another teaching that was shared with me from some of the Indigenous in Ontario, which is to work amongst all your relations. So that starts with yourself, then your family, be it blood related or chosen family, of course, then family and friends, community, nation, and then other nations, and kind of in this way give from the overflow. And I think that just helps it make it be sustainable. So how do we ensure the active engagement? I think it's assuring the well-being of the individual, and then from there having these spaces like the one that Batul and Christine are creating today, so that when things do align, they can participate, they can be here and have those spaces available for those who are ready.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Eric. Thank you. All points to important points that we'll all discuss and go over in the next few questions, but I'll hand it to Christine for now.
Thank you for your perspectives on the active engagement. Our next question, we'll start with Gertrude. How can civil society organizations address the issues of youth, for example, unemployment and teenage pregnancy, that has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic to ensure that affected youths bounce back from the crisis?
This is such a good question, Christine, especially in the case of unemployment, which obviously we as the employees don't have too much bearing on it. And for me, sorry for those who are international, I might have to give a Canadian example. While I'm not a spokesperson for this organization, I'd like to take a minute to kind of highlight the work that they're doing in regards to responding to the needs of youth during COVID-19. I'm currently a researcher at Pivot Canada 2020, and this initiative is an information gathering project to essentially create an accessible database that are grounded in youth priorities and opportunities. And so what we're doing is we have researchers all over the country, and they're gathering perspectives from youth on various indices. And then we're going to put that as an open database in which initiatives such as these, or initiatives such as different policies, can use the perspectives of youth. With compromised kind of education and employment opportunities, all I can say, what has been very helpful for me was to leverage your networks. And so for me, if you're having challenges in getting some sort of employment, reach out to people that you do know, maybe fellow colleagues, or maybe old professors, or your boss's boss. My whole thing is let everyone and anyone know that you are needing employment and what your areas of interest are. You'd be surprised kind of somewhere where opportunities lie. And so for me, for example, I had a colleague in a different organization that I was working with, and through knowing me, she connected me with someone else saying, I think you guys are compatible in these various things. And so I would say really leverage your networks now. And nurture the networks that you do have, because they might lead to something bigger than what you expect. And so those would be kind of my advice for you. Take advantage of the opportunities you have in your particular countries. Try to get involved with initiatives that are targeting youth and trying to hear youth voices. A lot of country representatives realize that youth are the future, and so they have a lot of initiatives for youth. So we'll try to get involved and leverage your networks. And so just to switch it up, I will pass that to Yiping to hear his perspective.
Thanks, Gertrude.
Sure. I think Gertrude, you provided some really important reflections about, what is maybe an individual's approach to tackling this very important topic of unemployment from a youth or young person's perspective. I think the way that the question is phrased around how can civil society organizations approach this a bit better, and perhaps thinking about our institutions that are there supposed to support our communities, including our young people, is how does this all fit into the overall response to COVID-19, recognizing that there have been significant social and economic disruptions to people of all walks of life, and perhaps there have been very disproportionate impacts for those that have been making their kind of living out of certain industries like travel, tourism, food and beverage, like hospitality, depending on the communities or depending on where we are in the country or around the world. But I think we have to be thoughtful and intentional about how we address how young people and youth are impacted by these economic disruptions, and how does this also build within to the COVID-19 response itself, including thinking about creatively how are we able to support the industries and sectors that need supporting during the pandemic response, like our public health workforce, like our healthcare workforce, our essential workforce. Like we have lots of young people, and myself, when I was in high school, I worked at a grocery store as a bag clerk, bagging groceries. And how do we support young people wherever they are in their journey of professional growth and development, so that they feel like they can continue their lives in terms of professional development, but also are supported in all those pieces. And the other component that was asked in the question around teenage pregnancy, I think is important to address, because not every young person or any person really always has a safe home to go to, and if that if there is even a home to go to sometimes. So I think thinking about those that were already in very precarious, vulnerable situations, and how do we fix those fault lines systemically, and how do we act very quickly during a pandemic response that has been going on for these past few months, to be able to support those that need things like healthcare services and other social resources, so that those disruptions don't come in a way that limits their access. So I think that all kind of goes into how can we think creatively about and intentionally about these disproportionate impacts to youth that might not be the same ones as we have come to learn about, say, people who are older, people who are immunocompromised, people have complex medical histories that might be impacted by the direct impacts of COVID-19 infection, but some of these ripple effects that we know will impact youth through some of the things that we've already discussed. And how do we build that into thinking creatively about how do we respond, like supporting the health workforce, supporting the public health workforce. In Canada, we've had students, people also come out of retirement to support public health work. So how do we think creatively around some of these pieces so that we're able to respond effectively and get over this together?
Thank you for your unique perspectives in talking about supporting youth. Eric, if you want to talk about this briefly.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll keep in mind your note on briefly. So, it says for youth to bounce back from the crisis. I think it would be a disservice to say bounce back as if we can kind of wait till the end to bounce back. I think the work starts since March, right? Right away, there's a need for a way to ideally not even just survive, but thrive in this environment as best as possible. So when we come out the other side, we're not trying to grapple our way back out, but seamlessly transition into what I presume will be a new normal, as I doubt it'll be back how it was. So with that in mind, I think a lot of community organizations have been doing exactly this. They've been demanding greater amount of funding. They've been leaning into the services they provide and been bolstering them. And instead of trying to shy away, this is why these organizations exist, is to provide services to those in need, and that's now more than ever. And so, to give an example of some organizations, it's about being creative on how to then provide them instead. Maybe that means looking at funding to provide the technology required to plug in to resources and events like this. Being able to provide cell phones with some amount of texting available, so you can do texting, and that being of importance for people who are at risk homes where maybe they can't do a phone call because then the maybe abusive parents or the parents who aren't accepting of an LGBTQ2 plus individual, or someone who may be sexually active when their parents would not be allowing of it, they would need another medium to do that, and texting could be an option. And so just really looking at how to access those at most risk and who have the least access to sort of online, on the phone, on the text, and provide those services to them in a way that's safe and adaptable to the circumstance. That again will look very different depending on the context, but even just here in rural Canada is a great example of a low resource situation, and that has large effect of the last mile effect in terms of the price to get internet, reliable internet at that, and looking into long-term options. Maybe this is a learning opportunity to see, is internet a human right to a certain extent, given the direction the world is moving. This is something that's been talked about in some of the other sessions in this youth summit, and seeing, we've seen it in some states, individual states in the US that make public the infrastructure required for even electricity, when they were still building the country, for folks who are more rural, who would otherwise be priced out essentially from gaining access to electricity. If you just look at market demand and supply kind of rules. So are those options that we can start pushing towards and advocating for? Those are, I think, questions we should be asking ourselves moving beyond the crisis, but as we try and not just survive, but thrive through it.
Thank you so much on your perspectives. Batul, you can go ahead.
Thanks, Christine. Let's just move to the third question, which relates more to the policies that we can take during the recovery period. So I'll start with you, Yuping, since you worked with a lot of marginalized communities. So with the compromised access to education, how can we ensure that the voices of the affected young girls and marginalized communities are still reflected within the policies targeted to educational policies amidst COVID-19 recovery period?
Thanks for the question, Batul. I think Eric touched on a little bit of this in terms of access to Wi-Fi. We know that there's been extreme disruptions to educational systems around the world, certainly here in Canada. I think it's really exciting that we have such diverse representation here in this particular event, because I think there's much to be learned about how do we shift to more virtual formats, and here we are also in a virtual format. So some of those most basic pieces that I think, how do we continue to have educational systems and educational resources delivered through something like this, through Zoom, is really important. And all of the infrastructure, I think that's too fancy of a word, more like the tools and the supplies and the technologies needed for the youth or young person to be able to effectively learn in a space like this is so important. So having stable like wireless internet connection or Ethernet internet connection, having the tools like a laptop, a tablet, a phone. Sometimes those pieces we, or at least I, sometimes take for granted. And how do we ensure that access to those things also be, very available, so that we can promote education and continue education despite these disruptions to in-person education. As well as I think about the learning environment. We know that where at least here I am sitting or standing in my home in Ottawa, but having a safe, quiet space where young people are able to learn is really important, and not every home is safe. Not every home is compatible for that kind of a learning environment. So I think those are some, I think, very basic foundational pieces that if we're able to think think critically about to ensure continuation of education. And once again, and that's only on the side of the learner. Then there's the side of the educator, how to adapt education that sometimes might be quite tricky to deliver in a virtual format. Yeah, so I'll leave it there.
Awesome, thanks a lot, Yubing. I'll just ask the same question to Eric, since you have also this experience working with marginalized communities. So if you can briefly go over the answer, thank you.
Yeah, I think I would echo a lot of things I was saying earlier, in that Yiping was identifying with, identifying barriers to access to education, and then looking at what are the tools and ways to make it accessible then from there, and understanding that it may be using more than one tool. I think there's a tendency to look at the solution as opposed to the solutions. That is more than one, and understanding, of course, there are different learners, and seeing how that could affect those at the margins of the learning spectrum. Right? I mean, if learning in class can be difficult on Zoom, I can only imagine. I'm thankful that I'm not going through that myself, but have heard many stories about the transition. And I think Yiping brings a very important point of the educator side and even administration side, and kind of the providers of education. Sort of what are the supports and resources that are being created for those individuals and those organizations and institutions. I'm not aware of sort of civil society organizations that support that end of the spectrum. I think it comes down to the Ministry of Education and the teachers themselves and their unions to sort of support whatever needs they may have and be that voice. Now, I understand that may not fall under the category of youth, but of course, if you're a young emerging educator, then it would, right? And so seeing how that could affect that would be curious. I don't have as much experience on that end, but I'd be curious to see sort of how that's going, just from some basic conversations with friends who are instructors. It's at least here in BC that it's sort of wait and see what the plan is, with the plan being something that could last a week and then change again, and sort of at the same time trying to keep up with giving the quality of education to the students that they like. And after having been away from school for 6 months, essentially, it's very unique. Nothing in their training would have prepared them for this, as for many professions in this time. So yeah, I think kind of looking at both sides would be important.
Awesome, thank you. So Gertrude, if you want to comment on this question. Thank you.
Hi, as my fellow speakers have already said, this question seems to have more questions than answers on our regard. And kind of dovetailing this question to the one that Madeline put in the chat as well, in how to engage older adults and how to make the processes that we're trying to engage youth more relevant and appealing to young people. These are all very good questions. But for me, as somebody who works internationally, I recognize, and I think we can all recognize in our respective countries, that we are kind of we have a lot of advantages. One being that we can be online on a computer, on a call, and have really good connection to connect internationally. And so I think for me, when I think about this question specifically about girls and marginalized communities, I think about the communities that I was working with where education was already subpar prior to COVID-19. And think about the Indigenous communities that I worked with here in Alberta, where they didn't even have a place that they could learn. They didn't have proper infrastructure for the schools and all that. And so for me, this question really is one that I think is very topical for us in terms of not only reaching students who have been disrupted, but also reaching the students in most needs. I think I have nothing to add, and I'm really taking some of the points that my fellow speakers have said, but I think for me, this is my main concern in regards to COVID-19 and trying to not leave anyone behind in the spirit of international development. What does that mean for us and our fellow brothers and sisters? So for me, I have more questions than answers. And I would really like to see maybe in the chat for people in various countries, kind of some of the initiatives that they've seen in their countries that are working, and some of the initiatives that they've seen from other presenters during this conference that they think they would like to share. I would really like to see any of the responses to the questions in the chat if you have any. So.
Perfect, and we look forward to discussing, these initiatives in a few minutes. But back to Christine.
All right, thank you guys for your perspectives on educational opportunities. It seems evident that there are more questions than answers. Let's see if what you guys' perspective are on what can young people do to put pressure on governments to include them in employment opportunities. Perhaps you can start with Yiping.
Sure, thanks, Christine, for the question. So I feel quite privileged to live here in Ontario, in Canada. Thinking about open government and transparency and accessibility, one of the things that I found out, there's like an active consultation process for an action plan for open government for people that are in Canada, I suppose, or Canadians, to get involved in and provide input. So I think that's, a direct way to shape how open government looks like in Canada. The other thing that I feel very, privileged about is being in a society where I have elected officials at various levels, at the municipal or local level, our provincial level, and our federal level, for looking out for the best interests of the constituents or the community members that they represent. So those are really good ways that I see as an approach to voice certain issues or actionable items that come up to our elected officials, as they have that duty and that responsibility to represent us at those tables for making certain decisions. And I think the other piece is probably finding the mentors, the allies that see the potential in youth and young people to be able to help advance some of the really important issues that matter most to us. And sometimes those issues and areas for intervention are only identified by youth, as we see with many issues being pushed forward through youth activism in Canada, but also very importantly around the world, and gaining international traction on certain issues. So I think there's a lot to be done around how do we mobilize and organize at a grassroots level with one another, but also use some of those mechanisms that do exist, if they do exist, to allow for representatives that represent our best interests as a community member, as a constituent, and so forth, in the tables that they represent us at. I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Yiping. Can go to Gertrude next.
In my regard, I have not much to add, but to just echo what Yiping is also saying. But I think one thing that I'd like to highlight is maybe the use of social media that Yiping has already mentioned in terms of putting pressure on governments. I know it's been very well used the past few months in kind of highlighting some of the social issues that various countries are having, Canada, Nigeria, and the various African countries as well. And so I think that is a tool that is well versed with youth who use them. And so I would add that as a potential tool. And also, I would also say for youth, what I found to be really inspiring for me is seeing some youth start initiatives in which they don't have to necessarily wait for an older person or a government organization to start. And so I employ the youth who have the facilities, who have the capacity, who have the connections to start an initiative in your respective areas to do so. For me, in my regard, I decided to take this inspiring act for myself, and I'm applying for a community grant, something that I've never done before. And I'm really excited. I'm really scared to apply, but I'm really excited because I've seen a gap in my community where I live, and I think I can do something about it. no matter how small. And so for me, I'm trying that route as well because I see it as a need. And so I employ all the people in the call. If there's a need and there's an avenue to effect change, don't wait for the change to happen. You can effect it yourself as well. So that's all I would say to that. And Eric, you have the pleasure.
Oh, thank you. That was a really good way to put it. I think that's super critical. Is you know, I was going to look into, or I was going to share the concept of getting involved with initiatives and organizations that already exist, and I can go into that in a bit. But I think it's really important to not rule out beginning your own initiative. I think, again, now more than ever, as the phrase goes, there are more unique needs that there would not be an initiative available to address it. And so don't be surprised if that's the case, and don't let that be a dead end or the end of the road for trying to make that change. Building upon sort of social media campaigns is looking at advocacy campaigns in general and looking at advocacy strategies or training. There's an organization called Results Canada that often provides these kinds of trainings, and even in mid-November on a weekend, they have a conference coming up where they will equip attendees with tools and strategies for advocacy. And my understanding is it'll be in the Canadian context, but it's really just about translating who the target of the advocacy is to what your context may be in terms of power mapping, right? So who holds the power to make the decisions in government and so on, and what the, you know, is Twitter the best way versus LinkedIn versus whatever that may be, an in-person meeting, and so on. Writing op-eds, our newspaper is accessible, and so just adjusting those strategies, but getting sort of the essential and fundamentals of what the goal and purposes are. That's a good way to start. And so from that, then I think the second piece, and it's almost as, I would say more important, it's as important as starting the advocacy initiative is then sustaining it. It's oftentimes where it's seen there's a big bubble and of excitement, you know, but then it sort of fizzles out, and finding creative ways to sustain the engagement and realizing it's you're going for the long run in a lot of times for these kinds of things. You know, change is slow. For all we would like it to not be. Change is slow, especially kind of at the government level, which is what this question asks about. And so understanding that a campaign, there'll be many campaigns, and it's really about building a movement that goes above and beyond even yourself, and understanding, you know, your capacity to be involved in such activities may ebb and flow, wax and wane over time, depending on other demands, unless of course you're lucky enough to have that as your gainful employment and job, and of course you likely would be able to continue it, but oftentimes that's not the case, especially for the things that matter most. And so understanding how to, again, kind of going back to that first part of taking care of yourself and giving from the overflow, realizing this work will be above and beyond yourself, and it's about finding the times and opportunities where you can contribute in your way. A phrase I like to say, and I shared it recently with Yipping, it's, you know, we all bring one grain of sand, and together we can make an ocean of change. And that's really how you can think about what you can contribute. It's not shouldering the full responsibility yourself, but seeing where you can give, when, and how.
Thank you so much. I think that's a great note to end our panel discussion on. I will pass it over to Batul to ask our first question and answer.
Perfect, thanks, Christine. So our first question we have, where does data play a role in how international organizations can bridge the gap between youth and government? And can IOS international organizations reach youth in places in ways that governments can't reach or won't be able to reach during pandemics? I guess due to the time restrictions, we'll just, whoever wants from our guest speakers to answer that, please go ahead.
Sure, I can start, Batul. International organizations, and I'll also just tag on there, multilateral organizations play a huge role in all of these important conversations about advancing issues related to youth and young people. It was part of my bio, but I forgot to mention it earlier on, but over these past few months, I've had the privilege of being the Canadian Youth Delegate to the World Health Assembly, the 73rd iteration that took place in May and will be resuming in November in a few days, few short weeks, and also the 58th Pan American Health Organization Directing Council. And having a bit of a snapshot into how multilateral organizations, including international organizations, advance youth priorities and issues, I think has been really interesting in terms of how do we ensure that the stakeholders, so for an example, if we're talking about a multilateral organization such as the World Health Organization, how can we have member states, 194 member states, be accountable to the issues and priorities of youth and young people? One of the really great things that I've experienced through the Canadian delegation is that they've kept me on board and engaged, and if not more engaged than previous years, because they really wanted to make the experience a meaningful one for me and the others that I've had the privilege of learning from to be able to shape those youth perspectives going into those meetings. So I think it's so important that we have that perspective of inviting youth in, as well as making that space where youth and young people enter, whether it be an international organization, whether it be a multilateral organization, or whether it be our own country or nation governments, that they be safe spaces for youth, for our voices to be respected and valued as equals. And that's a really challenging thing to do sometimes for those that hold power traditionally, and how to rethink some of those governance structures to be able to allow for more free discourse and debate and discussion, particularly when it comes to youth and young people and the really amazing ideas and values that we bring forward. The other thing I guess I'll mention is through my experiences being the youth delegate, I've had the opportunity to learn from some of the other youth delegates around the world and their experiences. And unfortunately, I've heard anecdotes, but I think stories mean so much in terms of how we as people kind of shape future decisions and policies. But what I've learned from other youth delegates is that their programs at their members in their member states and their nations have been scaled back during this pandemic. I think there has been perhaps a desire to a reasonable and important desire to move very quickly, to be able to make decisions quickly and perhaps involve less stakeholders. But I think that's a really challenging thing, and perhaps is the complete opposite of what we're talking about here in terms of open government, accessibility, transparency, when you involve less stakeholders, when you involve less youth and young people. I was able to learn that previous to this year, there were only 10 member states around the world, Netherlands, Romania, Lebanon, Denmark, Egypt, Lithuania, Ireland, Mexico, Switzerland, and Canada that had youth delegates to the World Health Assembly, the highest decision-making table for the World Health Organization. And to my understanding, and to this day, only Canada has kind of kept really the youth delegate engaged. I would really want someone to tell me that's wrong, that another member state around the world has been able to involve youth in their delegation to some extent, but to my knowledge, that hasn't held true. So I think there's so much to be said around how do we amplify each other's voices through things like youth delegate programs, or through like programs within other international organizations, or through our own nation governments. Thanks, I'll leave it there.
Thanks a lot to you, Bing, and that's a wrap to our session. Thanks a lot to our guest speakers for sharing their insights and experiences in such a highly dynamic topic. And thanks a lot for our attendees from all over the world and the summit organizers to give us this space to connect with youth from basically every corner in this world. And we look forward to staying in touch with all of you. So please feel free to join our student and young professional network to connect with more researchers and youth activists in the global health field, and to translate your ideas into actionable research projects and change. And for that, I leave it there. Thank you.
Before we end off, I recognize there's quite a few questions in the chat. So please feel free to just copy them and you can respond to the respective people. I know Alonso has put his contact if anyone wants to get acquainted. And so please feel free to share what you would like and how to continue connecting with people.
Awesome. Thank you, Gertrude.
Thank you, everyone from Croatia to Mali. Bye.
Bye.
Do you need us to
Thank
stay?
you, everyone.
No, that's it. Thank you.
Okay, cheers. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Nice
Bye.
meeting you, Eric. Bye, Ping.